Well, hundreds of EU nationals living in Britain have joined up with British citizens living in the EU for a day of protest to demand protection of their rights after Brexit. The action centered on London with a mass lobby of British members of Parliament. Now, this comes hot on the heels of a pro-EU protest in London at the weekend. The post-Brexit fate of around 3 million European citizens living in Britain and over 1 million UK nationals living in the EU is one of the most contentious issues in the negotiations of Britain's withdrawal from the EU. Britain has proposed to offer permanent rights over health care, education, welfare, pensions to Europeans who arrive before a cutoff date. Now, that is an offer that activists have dismissed as, quote, pathetic. Well, I'm joined now by Jenny Hayhurst. She is a British citizen living here in Berlin. She's a member of the activist coalition British in Europe, which claims to have about 35,000 active members. Jenny, it's good to have you on the show. Talk to me a little bit about your personal situation. How long have you lived in Germany?
So I'm one of the relatively new British citizens in Germany. I've been here for 2 years, and I lived in France for a year previously to that.
So you've been here for 2 years, so you're not eligible for German citizenship. And, you know, it's like John was mentioning earlier, what happens to your residency status after, or residency status here in Germany after 2019, after Brexit is a done deal?
Well, unfortunately, there's not a lot of clarity on that at the moment. So, as you said, because I've only been here for 2 years, I'm nowhere near to the threshold that I would have to cross in order to be eligible for German citizenship. So right now, and this is one of the reasons that I've been so passionately involved with the group British in Europe, it's really a case of lobbying and trying to make sure that we get as much certainty as possible when it comes to safeguarding the rights that I enjoy here and that 1.2 other million British citizens enjoy in the European Union.
Who are you lobbying to? Who's listening to you?
Both sides. So both the British side of things, British government, we've had some really productive meetings there, and also the EU side, we've had some meetings with countless EU people. And I think what's also really important is we've had a great collaboration with the 3 million, which is the group representing the EU citizens living in the UK. So it's really been a joint endeavour on both sides, putting pressure on both parties to really drive home this message that we're not bargaining chips, that our rights are incredibly important to us, and that this uncertainty is disastrous for people's daily lives.
Jane Golding, who's the chair of British in Europe lobby group, she was quoted today as saying, understandably, EU citizens in the UK are much more present and people are more aware of their situation than ours. I mean, are you part of the forgotten Brits of Brexit?
Gosh, well, I think there's been quite a lot of misrepresentation in the media. There tends to be this image, particularly in the British media, of British people living in the EU being pensioners living in Spain. And while the majority of British citizens who live in the EU do live in Spain, there are over 100,000 of us here in Germany. The vast majority of British people who live in the EU are of working age as well. So there's a certain kind of image problem there, I think.
Well, you're not getting the attention that you should receive, right, to tell the complete story.
Having said that, I think since the beginning of British in Germany and British in Europe, attention has really snowballed. So it's been fantastic that more and more British people have kind of maybe come out of the woodwork and joined the groups. And there's been this fantastic feeling of solidarity, people making connections all across Germany and across Europe.
Have you gotten the message from people back in the UK that, hey, listen, you should come home, you have a country, come and work here, help your home country? Have you gotten that message from people at all?
I think most people that I've spoken to personally really respect this European spirit, the fact that all of us who moved here in good faith. We moved to the European Union because we were certain that our rights here would be guaranteed for life. And that's exactly one of our key aspects that we're asking. For example, in the mass lobby today in London, we asked MPs, that was one of our 5 pledges that we asked from the MPs, this lifetime guarantee of our rights.
Is there a misconception out there that no matter where you are in Europe, that things will be just fine and that life will, even after Brexit, life will continue and go on as it did before Brexit?
I think that's a difficult perspective to have when you are in this situation of being caught in limbo, where the clock is ticking on Brexit, and when it comes to really fundamental rights, so for example, if you're reliant on a pension, or if you have a long-term health condition and there's just a lot of uncertainty as to what the healthcare provisions will be following Brexit. If you're a young person like me, I'm starting my master's now, and I'm hoping that my educational qualifications will be recognised in 2 years' time.
Yeah, that's up in the air as well, right?
Yeah,
you don't know.
Absolutely.
Do you, and we have to go back to that referendum that happened last year in the UK. The referendum is an advisory referendum. It's not a binding referendum. Do you believe that Brexit will indeed happen? Will it come to pass? Is there a chance that it will not take place?
I think it's a very interesting question. It's a question I've been asked a lot, especially by Germans here in Berlin. I think that there's still so much uncertainty as to whether Brexit will happen, what it will look like. You hear hard Brexit, soft Brexit. And I think what's important that we mustn't forget in the midst of all this uncertainty is that this is about people's everyday lives. And quite aside from these abstract questions of will it, won't it, in what shape, in what form, we need to focus on the really important issues.
But if there were a second Brexit referendum held today in the UK, what do you think? Would it pass or would it fail?
Gosh.
What does your gut tell you?
My gut feeling, oh my goodness. I wouldn't like to say. I wouldn't like to.
Okay, well, see, that shows you right there how torn the country may be.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, has Brexit forced you to choose sides? I mean, do you feel like you have to retain your British identity, or do you feel somewhat betrayed by that and that you're forced to take on a non-British European identity?
Well, for me, there's never been any contradiction whatsoever between a British identity and a European identity. I think that's the same goes for many young people in my generation, and I would imagine the majority of British people living here in the European Union. It's a fantastic privilege living here in the EU to be able to have these two identities and to nurture them side by side. And that's something that has been perhaps called into question by the referendum. I think certainly in the run-up to the referendum, in the campaign.
The people who voted for the referendum did not see that privilege as being important.
There was this perceived friction between the two layers of identity, but I think it's always been so obvious to me how much we share, not just kind of culturally, economically, linguistically, but and historically as well, but in terms of values, in terms of how we live our lives. And that's surely far too important to be put down to having to pick sides.
Yeah, I hope for all of our sakes that you do not have to pick sides in this, and that after 2019, hopefully you won't have to worry about your residency status either. Jenny Hayhurst, thank you for taking the time to be on the show and sharing your story. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.